It was late summer, and the air had that faint crispness that hinted at the coming autumn. I decided to take a solo hiking trip to clear my head. Life had been too noisy lately, with work and responsibilities piling up. I needed a break. I chose a trail that was reputed to be challenging but scenic. It was located in a relatively remote area of Vermont, far from the well-trodden paths filled with weekend hikers. The trail stretched deep into the woods, eventually climbing to an isolated ridge with sweeping views of the valley below. I started early, just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. My backpack was packed with everything I thought I might need: extra layers, water, food, a small first aid kit, and a map of the area. I was always careful about preparation, knowing how quickly things could go wrong in the wilderness. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. I locked my car, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and began walking. The first few miles were uneventful, the trail winding gently through a dense forest of maple and birch trees. Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, my mind quieting with each step. The forest had a way of doing that, pulling you out of your own head and into the present moment. After a couple of hours, the trail began to climb. The trees thinned, and patches of rock started to appear. I stopped for a water break, leaning against a boulder and looking out over the forest below. The view was already impressive, even though I wasn't near the summit yet. The air smelled clean, a mix of pine and earth. I checked my map to confirm my position and continued on, feeling confident in my progress. As I climbed higher, the trail became less defined. It was clear that not many people hiked this route. Fallen branches and overgrown brush partially obscured the path, and I had to rely on the occasional trail marker painted on trees to stay on course. It slowed me down, but I didn't mind. I had all day and wasn't in a rush. Around midday, I reached a small clearing and decided to stop for lunch. The clearing was bordered by a rocky outcrop, and a narrow stream trickled nearby. I sat on a flat rock, unwrapped a sandwich from my pack, and listened to the sound of the water. It was peaceful, and for a while I let myself just sit there, enjoying the solitude. After lunch, I resumed my hike. The trail steepened sharply, and the ground grew rockier. My legs ached, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that reminded me I was doing something physical, something real. I was completely alone now. I hadn't seen another person since I started. That was part of what I loved about hiking. Being away from the noise and the crowds, with only my thoughts and the natural world around me. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to feel a little uneasy. The forest had grown quieter. The birdsong and rustling leaves that had accompanied me earlier seemed to have faded away. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Sometimes the woods could play tricks on you, especially when you were alone. I reached the ridge by mid-afternoon. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of green and gold, with the faint outline of distant mountains on the horizon. I sat on a rock to catch my breath and took a long drink from my water bottle. This was what I'd come for. The feeling of being on top of the world, far from the stresses of everyday life. After resting for a while, I decided to head back. I wanted to be off the trail before dark, and I knew the descent would be tricky in places. I retraced my steps, carefully navigating the rocky sections. The unease I'd felt earlier hadn't entirely left me, but I tried to ignore it. I was being silly, I told myself. There was nothing out here but trees and wildlife. But then I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. A boot print in the dirt. It was fresh, the edges sharp and unblurred by wind or rain. That wouldn't have been strange on its own. This was a hiking trail after all, but the print wasn't facing in the same direction I'd come from. It was heading up the trail the same way I had been going earlier. I hadn't seen anyone all day. How could someone have passed me without me noticing? I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The woods were still and silent. I felt a prickle of unease but forced myself to keep moving. It was probably just another hiker who had taken a different route or started earlier in the day. As I continued down the trail, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my pulse quicken. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the solitude and the strange footprint. But then I noticed something else. Another boot print, this time on a patch of mud near the trail. It was facing the same direction as the first one, heading up the trail. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had left those prints was following the same path I had taken, but they hadn't crossed my path on the way up. That meant they must have been behind me the entire time. Quickened my pace, my heart pounding. The rational part of my mind told me there was probably a perfectly innocent explanation for the prints. Maybe someone had started hiking after me and taken a break off trail, which was why I hadn't seen them. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The trail grew steeper as it descended, and I had to focus on my footing. Loose rocks and tree roots made it easy to trip. I was so focused on watching the ground that I almost missed it, the faint sound of movement behind me. It was distant, just the faintest rustling of leaves, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The sound stopped, too. The woods were silent again, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Swallowing hard, I started walking again, faster this time. My unease had turned to fear, a gnawing sense that I wasn't alone. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade. The shadows grew longer, and the forest took on an eerie quality. I forced myself to keep moving, checking my map occasionally to make sure I was on the right path. I didn't want to get lost, not with the sun setting and the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I finally reached the lower section of the trail, where the ground leveled out and the trees grew thicker. I was close to the trailhead now, but the sense of relief I'd expected didn't come. Instead, the feeling of being watched intensified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. And then I saw it, just a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I whipped my head around, but whatever it was had already disappeared. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I broke into a jog, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel path. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one in the parking lot. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and unlocked the door. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was still racing as I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the woods. But there was nothing, just the empty trailhead fading into the distance. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I finally started to relax. Whatever had happened out there, I was safe now. But the experience stayed with me, a lingering unease that I couldn't shake. I still don't know what I saw, or if I saw anything at all. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, fueled by isolation and fear. Or maybe there really was someone out there watching me, following me. I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I won't be hiking alone again anytime soon. The forecast promised clear skies, perfect for hiking. I'd picked out a trail I'd read about online, remote, not too challenging, and supposedly breathtaking. It was exactly what I was looking for. The idea of spending a whole day in nature, away from the noise and distractions of daily life, felt like exactly what I needed. I woke up early, packed my bag with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a lightweight jacket, and drove out to the trailhead. The road was empty, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. I felt a sense of calm as I pulled into the small dirt parking lot. There were only a couple of cars parked there, which was perfect. I wasn't looking for crowds. I strapped on my backpack, locked the car, and headed toward the trail. It started off easy, the path wide and well-trodden. Trees lined both sides, their leaves just beginning to turn the warm hues of autumn. The air was crisp but not cold, and the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel was the only noise I could hear. It felt good, peaceful. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The trail climbed steadily but not steeply, and soon I was surrounded by dense forest. The further I went, the narrower the path became. It wasn't long before I noticed how quiet everything was. At first, I found it relaxing, but as the hours passed, the silence began to feel heavy. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, making you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your footsteps, and every rustle of leaves. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued to the left, marked clearly by a wooden sign pointing toward a scenic overlook. To the right was a narrower, less obvious path with no sign. It looked more like a game trail than something meant for hikers. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to stick to the main trail. The idea of wandering off into unmarked territory didn't appeal to me. As I continued up the trail, I noticed the trees growing thicker, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air felt cooler here, damp and still. I checked my map and GPS periodically, making sure I was still on course. Everything seemed fine. The trail was supposed to loop around and bring me back to the starting point by late afternoon. About 3 hours in, I realized I hadn't seen a single other person. It struck me as odd. The trailhead wasn't empty, and this was supposed to be a popular hike. Where was everyone? I brushed the thought aside, reasoning that maybe they had taken shorter trails or started earlier and were already on their way back. I stopped to drink some water and eat a granola bar, sitting on a rock by the side of the trail. As I rested, I noticed something strange, a faint but distinct smell. It was sour, like rotting vegetation or spoiled food. I looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing unusual, just trees, leaves, and the rocky trail. The smell lingered, though faint and unsettling. I decided it was time to keep moving. The trail began to climb more steeply, winding its way up the side of a ridge. The effort warmed me up, and I started to sweat despite the cool air. I could feel my thighs burning with each step, but I pushed on, eager to reach the overlook. That was supposed to be the highlight of the hike, and I didn't want to miss it. After another hour, I reached a clearing. It wasn't the overlook, just an open area where the trees thinned out, offering a partial view of the surrounding mountains. I stopped to catch my breath and take in the scenery. The sky was a brilliant blue, the peaks towering in the distance. It was beautiful, but something about the clearing felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was nothing obviously out of place, yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I stood there, I heard it, a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere further up the trail. It was a rhythmic, almost metallic tapping. Top, top, top. I froze, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound stopped, leaving only the eerie silence of the forest. My rational mind told me it was probably just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or a branch tapping against a rock. But something about it didn't sit right. I decided to keep going, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My pace quickened, my focus narrowing to the trail ahead. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. The trail became rougher as I climbed higher. Loose rocks and exposed roots made the going slower, and I had to watch my footing carefully. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed darker, even though it was still mid-afternoon. I checked my GPS again, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart sink. The map showed I was no longer on the main trail. Somehow I had veered off course. I couldn't understand how it had happened. I hadn't seen any other forks or side trails. Yet here I was, miles from where I was supposed to be. I stood there trying to decide what to do. Should I turn back and retrace my steps? Or keep going, hoping the trail would loop back around? Before I could decide, I heard it again. Top, top, top. This time it was closer. My chest tightened as adrenaline surged through me. I turned in the direction of the sound, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the dense forest, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I decided to head back the way I came. I turned around and started walking quickly, my eyes darting to every shadow, every rustling leaf. The forest seemed darker now, the trail more difficult to follow. I realized how easy it would be to get lost out here, with no cell service and no one around to help. As I hurried down the trail, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt, large, booted prints heading in the same direction I was going. They hadn't been there when I first came this way. Someone else was out here, and they weren't far ahead of me. I stopped, my mind racing. Who could it be? Another hiker? A hunter? Or someone who didn't want to be found? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to do. If I kept going, I might catch up to them. If I turned around, I'd be heading further away from the trailhead. The tapping sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. I started running. My heart pounded in my chest as I tore down the trail, not caring about the noise I was making. The forest blurred around me, my focus narrowing to the path ahead. I tripped over a root, falling hard onto my hands and knees. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept moving. The footprints were gone now, erased by my frantic steps. I didn't know if I was still on the trail or if I had veered off completely. All I knew was that I had to keep going. The tapping sound followed me, growing fainter and then louder again, as if whoever or whatever was making it was toying with me. Finally, I saw it. A break in the trees, a glimpse of the parking lot through the thinning forest. Relief flooded me as I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking with exhaustion. I burst out of the woods, gasping for air, and collapsed against the side of my car. I looked back at the trail, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just the silent, empty forest. I didn't wait around to catch my breath. I climbed into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. As I sped down the mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But the road was empty. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, that the sounds I'd heard were nothing more than my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something or someone had been out there with me. I haven't been back to that trail since. Hiking was always my way of escaping the noise of everyday life. It wasn't about conquering nature, but about being part of it, even if only for a little while. I had taken to exploring lesser-known trails, the ones tucked away from the crowds. They weren't the safest, but they offered solitude, which was what I craved. One Saturday in early October, I decided to try a trail I'd read about online. It was buried deep in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where the air felt crisper and the colors of autumn were more vibrant than anywhere else. This trail wasn't officially marked, and the only directions were a set of vague instructions posted by someone who claimed to have hiked it a few years ago. That was part of the draw. It felt like a hidden gem. I started early in the morning to make the most of the daylight. The first hour or so was uneventful. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but the forest was beautiful. Rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. There was no sound except for my boots crunching on the ground and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the trail became harder to follow. It wasn't a well-worn path, but more of a suggestion of one, marked by faint indentations in the dirt and the occasional cairn, a small stack of rocks left by previous hikers. I had to stop frequently to check my bearings, using the GPS on my phone and the printed map I'd brought along as a backup. It was around midday when I noticed the first odd thing. There was a pile of fresh animal bones just off the trail. They looked like they belonged to a deer, cleanly picked, white, and almost gleaming against the dark soil. I stopped to look at them, feeling a slight unease I couldn't quite explain. Predators were normal in the wild, of course, but something about this felt off. The bones didn't look weathered or scattered, which suggested whatever had eaten the deer had been here recently. Shaking off the unease, I pressed on. The trail climbed steeply after that, leading to a rocky outcrop with a view of the valley below. It was breathtaking, and for a moment, I forgot about the bones. The wind was stronger up here, tugging at my jacket, and the sun was bright and warm on my face. I ate a quick snack and drank some water before continuing. The descent on the other side of the outcrop was treacherous. Loose rocks slid underfoot, and the trail became even harder to follow. At one point, I lost it entirely and had to backtrack until I found a cairn. This part of the forest felt different, darker, quieter, and colder. Even though the sun was still high, the trees grew closer together, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like veins. Then came the second odd thing. I found another pile of bones, this time from a smaller animal. They were scattered across the trail, and there was a faint metallic smell in the air, blood, maybe, though I couldn't see any. I felt a prickle of unease again, stronger this time. I told myself it was just nature, that predators had to eat, and that I was overthinking things. By mid-afternoon, the trail leveled out, winding through a dense thicket of evergreens. I hadn't seen a cairn or any other sign of the trail in a while, but the GPS suggested I was still roughly on course. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you hyper-aware of every sound you make. I kept walking, but my pace had slowed. My instincts were screaming at me now, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I'd hiked alone countless times before, even in more remote areas than this, but I'd never felt like this, like I was being watched. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a crude structure ahead, built from branches and covered in leaves. It wasn't a proper shelter, just a haphazard lean-to, but it looked recent. The branches were green, freshly broken, and the leaves hadn't yet dried out. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. Inside the structure was a pile of clothing, ripped, dirty, and stained with what looked like blood. There were no signs of a campfire or any other supplies, just the clothes. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I came, trying to retrace my steps. But the forest seemed different now, as if the trail had shifted when I wasn't looking. The cairns I'd been following earlier were gone, and the GPS was no help. It showed my position as a blinking dot in a sea of green, with no clear path back to where I'd started. As the afternoon wore on, panic began to set in. I couldn't afford to be out here after dark, not without a clear trail to follow. I tried to stay calm, to think logically, I marked trees with bits of orange tape from my pack to avoid going in circles and focused on moving downhill, figuring it would eventually lead me to a stream or a road. It was near dusk when I found the third odd thing. It was a backpack, torn open and empty, lying in the middle of what I thought was the trail. There were deep gashes in the fabric, as if it had been slashed with a knife or claw. Nearby, I saw more bones, human this time. A skull, half buried in the dirt, stared up at me with hollow eye sockets. I froze, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. Someone or something had died here, and judging by the state of the bones, it hadn't happened that long ago. I didn't wait to find out more. I started running, not caring if I made noise or if I was even going in the right direction. I just needed to get out of there. The light was fading fast, and the shadows between the trees grew longer and darker. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump, convinced something was following me. Finally, just as the last light of day faded, I stumbled onto a gravel road. I had no idea where it led, but I didn't care. I followed it, my legs aching and my lungs burning, until I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. The car belonged to an older couple who were driving back from a nearby town. They stopped when they saw me, and I must have looked a sight, dirty, scratched up, and wide-eyed with terror. They gave me a ride to the nearest ranger station, where I reported everything I'd seen. The rangers searched the area the next day but didn't find much. The lean-to was gone and so were the bones. They chalked it up to animal activity, but I knew what I'd seen. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just wildlife. I haven't gone hiking alone since that day. The wilderness used to feel like freedom, but now it feels like a reminder of how small and vulnerable we really are. I was never one for group hikes. Being alone on a trail gave me a sense of freedom I couldn't get anywhere else. No one's pace to match, no forced chatter, just the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt and the natural world around me. So, when I had a long weekend off work, I decided to tackle a section of the long trail in Vermont. It was late fall, and while most hikers had packed up for the season, I was drawn to the solitude and the crisp air. I planned to do a 3-day out and back. I'd park my car at a trailhead, hike up to a remote peak, camp there overnight, and retrace my steps the following day. It sounded simple enough. I packed my gear meticulously. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and extra layers. The forecast promised clear skies, though the temperatures were expected to dip below freezing at night. The first day started off perfectly. I hit the trail just after sunrise, my breath puffing in the cool morning air. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels gathering the last of their winter stores. The trail wound upward, gradually at first, then steeply as I climbed toward the ridge. Fallen leaves blanketed the ground, and every step seemed to crunch louder than the last. By midday, I reached a clearing with a stunning view of the surrounding mountains. I dropped my pack, pulled out a granola bar, and just stood there, taking it all in. The silence was profound, the kind that makes your ears strain to pick up any sound. For a moment, I felt completely at peace. The trail grew rougher as the afternoon wore on. Roots jutted out of the ground like the ridges of an old scar, and rocks slick with moss forced me to watch every step carefully. I stumbled once, my toe catching on a hidden root, and nearly went down face first. It was a reminder to stay focused. Out here, a twisted ankle could mean hours or even a full day before help could arrive. I reached my campsite an hour before sunset. It was a small clearing just off the trail with enough space for a single tent. Nearby, a small stream trickled over rocks, its sound soothing in the otherwise still forest. I set up camp quickly, knowing that the temperature would drop as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Dinner was simple: a dehydrated meal rehydrated with boiling water. As I ate, I listened to the forest. There were no animal calls, just the faint whisper of wind through the bare branches. It was eerily quiet, but I told myself it was just the season. Most animals had migrated or gone into hibernation by now. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the temperature had plummeted. I bundled up, pulling the drawstring of my sleeping bag tight around my face. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was restless. I kept waking up to the sound of something faint, almost imperceptible, like twigs snapping far off in the woods. Each time I convinced myself it was nothing, a deer maybe or a raccoon. The next morning, frost coated the ground, glinting in the first light of dawn. My breath hung in the air as I packed up camp, eager to get moving and warm up. I decided to push further along the trail before turning back. There was a viewpoint marked on my map a few miles ahead that I didn't want to miss. The trail felt different that day. The air was still, heavier somehow, and the quietness that I had found peaceful the day before now felt oppressive. Every so often, I thought I heard the faint crunch of leaves behind me, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was what I wanted after all, solitude. The viewpoint was worth the extra miles. From the rocky outcrop, I could see the entire valley spread out below, the hills rolling into the distance like frozen waves. I lingered there longer than I should have, knowing I still had to retrace my steps and make it back to the car by nightfall. On the way back, the sense of unease grew stronger. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling like the forest was watching me. I quickened my pace, the steady rhythm of my boots on the trail the only sound. As I descended the ridge, the daylight began to fade. Long shadows stretched across the trail, and the air grew colder with every passing minute. I realized I had underestimated how long it would take to get back. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was still an hour away from the trailhead. I turned on my headlamp, its beam cutting through the gathering darkness. The forest looked different in the artificial light, the trees looming taller, their bare branches like skeletal fingers. My breath came faster now, not from exertion but from a rising sense of urgency. I needed to get back to my car. Then I heard it, a deliberate snap of a twig, close enough that it couldn't be dismissed as an animal. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze, straining to see beyond the reach of my headlamp. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was nothing, but my gut said otherwise. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting from side to side. The trail seemed endless, the familiar landmarks I had noted on the way up now unrecognizable in the dark. Every so often, I stopped and listened, convinced I could hear footsteps behind me, always just out of sync with my own. When I finally reached the trailhead, relief washed over me. My car was still there, a lonely silhouette in the small gravel lot. I unlocked it with shaking hands, threw my pack into the back seat, and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and turned the headlights on, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees at the edge of the lot. A shadow, maybe, or a figure slipping out of sight. I didn't wait to find out. The tires skidded on the gravel as I pulled out onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I drove for miles before I finally began to relax, the lights of a small town appearing in the distance. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling I had on that trail, the sense that I wasn't alone. I tell myself it was all in my head, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the eerie quiet of the forest. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that shadow in the rearview mirror and wonder if I was wrong. It started as a perfect plan. I had taken a day off work to tackle a trail that had been on my mind for months. It wasn't particularly famous, which was exactly what I liked about it. No crowds, no litter, just me, the wilderness, and hours of quiet solitude. The trail wound through a remote section of the Green Mountains, far from the busy routes that most hikers preferred. I packed lightly, a small first aid kit, some granola bars, water, and an extra layer in case the weather turned. I didn't see the need to bring much else. After all, it was just a day hike. The drive out there was uneventful, the roads narrowing as I climbed into the hills. Patches of early frost clung to the shadows even though the sun was already high. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, grabbed my pack, and headed toward the trailhead. The air had that sharp, clean scent you only find in the mountains, and the quiet was comforting. The only sound came from my boots crunching the gravel as I walked. The first hour was bliss. The trail meandered through thick pine forests, the ground soft with fallen needles. Sunlight streamed through the branches in slanted beams, and the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird kept me company. I checked the weather the night before. Clear skies and mild temperatures all day. Felt like nothing could go wrong. About 3 miles in, the trail started to climb. I welcomed the challenge, enjoying the burn in my legs and the rhythmic thud of my boots on the ground. The forest opened up as I ascended, revealing glimpses of the valley below. I stopped for a quick break on a rocky outcrop, drinking water and marveling at the view. The world felt vast and endless, the horizon stretching far beyond what I could see. I didn't linger long. There was still plenty of trail ahead, and I wanted to reach the summit before noon. The climb grew steeper, the terrain more rugged. Loose rocks made the footing tricky, and I found myself focusing more on each step. It was somewhere around this point that I realized how isolated I was. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the parking lot, and the trail was silent except for the wind and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. About halfway to the summit, the first hint of trouble appeared. The sky, which had been bright and blue, was now overcast. The shift had been gradual, so I didn't notice it until the light dimmed. I wasn't too concerned. Mountain weather could be unpredictable, but I figured it would pass. Still, I made a mental note to keep an eye on it. The summit, when I finally reached it, was breathtaking. A narrow ridge stretched out before me with steep drops on either side. The view was a patchwork of forests, rivers, and rolling hills, all under a sky that had turned an ominous shade of gray. I sat down to eat a granola bar, enjoying the eerie stillness. For a moment, I felt like the only person in the world. But that moment didn't last. The wind picked up, cold and biting, and I noticed the clouds thickening. It wasn't just overcast anymore. It looked like a storm was brewing. I decided it was time to head back. There was no sense in pushing my luck. The descent was faster but trickier. The loose rocks I had carefully navigated on the way up now seemed more treacherous. The wind made it harder to keep my balance, and I found myself slipping more than once. I slowed my pace, focusing on each step. It was frustrating to move so cautiously, but the last thing I wanted was to twist an ankle miles from the nearest road. I was about a third of the way down when the rain started. It came suddenly, a cold, driving downpour that soaked me within minutes. The trail turned to mud under my boots, making the descent even more hazardous. Visibility dropped as the rain blurred everything around me. I kept moving, using my trekking poles to steady myself, but every step felt precarious. Then I slipped. One moment, I was carefully picking my way down a rocky section of the trail. The next, I was on my back, sliding down the slope. I managed to stop myself by grabbing onto a small tree, my heart pounding. My pack had twisted around, and my left leg throbbed where it had hit a rock. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, before carefully standing up. My leg hurt, but it held my weight. I took a few cautious steps, It wasn't broken, but I could tell I'd bruised it badly. The fall had disoriented me, and it took me a moment to find the trail again. The rain was relentless now, and the wind made it feel even colder. I kept moving, knowing I had to get lower before the weather got any worse. But the trail seemed different. The landmarks I remembered from the ascent were missing, or maybe I just wasn't recognizing them in the rain. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I realized I might have wandered off the main path. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. I told myself to stay calm, to think. I stopped and tried to get my bearings, but the forest looked the same in every direction. I couldn't hear anything over the rain and wind, and the thick clouds made it impossible to tell which way the sun was. I decided to keep moving downhill, reasoning that it would eventually lead me to a road or a stream I could follow. The hours blurred together after that. The rain never let up, and I was soaked to the bone, my clothes clinging to me like a second skin. My boots, once sturdy and reliable, felt like dead weight, squelching with every step. The temperature was dropping, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. My leg ached with every movement, but I couldn't stop. Stopping meant getting colder, and I knew that hypothermia was a real danger. Eventually, I stumbled onto a faint trail. It wasn't the one I had come up on, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in on all sides. My thoughts grew foggy, the exhaustion and cold taking their toll. I didn't even notice the light fading until I realized I was stumbling in near darkness. Just as I was starting to lose hope, I saw a light. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was there. I forced myself to move faster, ignoring the pain in my leg and the biting cold. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I realized it was coming from a cabin. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward it. The cabin was small and weathered, but it looked warm and inviting. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Desperate, I tried the handle, and to my immense relief, it opened. Inside, it was empty but dry. There was a wood stove in the corner and a stack of firewood next to it. I didn't hesitate. I lit a fire, the warmth spreading through the small space, and wrapped myself in a blanket I found in a trunk. I spent the night there, drying my clothes and letting the fire chase away the chill. The storm raged outside, but I felt safe for the first time in hours. In the morning, the rain had stopped, and the sky was clear. I found a map in the cabin that showed a nearby logging road, and I used it to navigate back to civilization. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted but incredibly grateful. The experience had shaken me, but it had also reminded me of the importance of preparation and respect for the wilderness. I knew I'd be back on the trails eventually, but next time, I'd be carrying more than just a water bottle and some granola bars. Hiking had always been my way of clearing my head. It was something about the rhythmic crunch of boots on dirt, the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the sense of being completely untethered from everyday distractions. That weekend, I decided to tackle a trail I'd been eyeing for months. A challenging but manageable loop in a remote part of the mountains. I arrived at the trailhead early on a Saturday morning, the air still holding the crispness of dawn. My pack was loaded with the essentials. Plenty of water, snacks, a first aid kit, a headlamp, and a lightweight jacket in case the weather turned. I had studied the trail map carefully and noted the key markers, streams to cross, an old fire tower near the halfway point, and a steep descent on the back end. Everything seemed straightforward. The first few miles were uneventful. The path wound through dense forest, the sun filtering through the canopy in golden streaks. I felt good, my pace steady, my breathing even. The forest was alive with sound, birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I paused occasionally to take in the scenery or to sip from my water bottle, but I was making excellent time. The trouble started around mile 6. The trail forked unexpectedly. The map I had printed showed no mention of this split. Both paths looked well-trodden, and there were no signs to indicate which direction to take. I stood there for a while, considering my options. The left trail seemed to descend slightly, while the right one stayed level. I reasoned that staying level was probably the safer bet, as the fire tower was supposed to be on a ridge. I took the right fork. At first, it seemed like I had made the correct choice. The trail continued to wind through the forest, and I spotted what looked like distant glimpses of higher ground. But after about 20 minutes, I noticed the path was narrowing. It was becoming less distinct, with overgrown bushes encroaching on either side. Still, I pressed on, convinced it would reconnect with the main trail eventually. Didn't. By the time I realized I was completely off course, the forest around me had changed. The trees were older, their trunks thicker and spaced farther apart. The ground was littered with fallen branches and patches of moss. The sense of being in untouched wilderness was exhilarating at first, but the excitement quickly gave way to unease. I pulled out my map, but it was useless now. I couldn't pinpoint where I had veered off, and the dense forest made it impossible to orient myself using landmarks. I checked my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but as expected, there was no signal this deep in the mountains. For a moment, I panicked. My breath quickened, and my thoughts raced, but I forced myself to calm down. I had enough supplies to last the day, and I was confident I could retrace my steps. I turned back the way I had come, scanning the ground for my footprints or any other signs of my passage. That was when I noticed something strange. The trail I had followed earlier was gone. The ground was uneven and cluttered with debris, as if no one had walked this way in years. I couldn't make sense of it. I knew I hadn't strayed that far, but the terrain seemed completely unfamiliar now. I checked my watch. It was just past noon. I decided to keep moving, hoping to intersect the main trail again. But the farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and the sense of being utterly alone began to weigh on me. Hours passed. My legs grew tired, and my water supply was dwindling. I tried to ration it, taking small sips to keep my mouth from going dry. I stumbled once, catching my foot on a hidden root, and scraped my hand on a rock as I fell. The sting of the cut jolted me back to reality. I couldn't afford to lose focus. As the afternoon light began to fade, I faced a difficult decision. Should I keep moving, hoping to find the trail before nightfall, or should I stop and set up a makeshift camp? I decided to keep going. I didn't like the idea of spending the night out here, especially without knowing where I was. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of leaves and the crunch of my boots. A distant, rhythmic rushing noise. Water. Relief surged through me. Streams and rivers were often marked on trail maps, and if I could find the water source, I might be able to figure out my location. I followed the sound, moving as quickly as I could through the underbrush. The noise grew louder, and soon I reached the edge of a steep embankment. Below, a wide river rushed past, its surface glinting in the fading light. Getting down to the river was no easy task. The slope was steep and littered with loose rocks. I slid and stumbled my way down, scraping my arms and legs in the process. But when I finally reached the water's edge, I felt a small flicker of hope. I crouched by the river and drank deeply, the cold water reviving me. I checked my map again, trying to match the river's course to anything marked on the page. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but I thought I recognized the bend in the river as being about 2 miles from the trailhead. If I followed the river downstream, I might find my way back. It wasn't easy navigating in the dark. My headlamp cast a narrow beam of light, but it didn't reveal much beyond a few feet ahead. The riverbank was uneven, with tangled roots and hidden holes that threatened to trip me at every step. The noise of the rushing water was disorienting, making it hard to hear anything else. At one point, I thought I heard movement behind me, branches snapping, the crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. Probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. I pressed on, my exhaustion mounting. My legs felt like lead, and every step was a struggle. But eventually, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. It was too steady to be moonlight and too warm to be starlight. A fire. My heart leapt. I quickened my pace, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. As I drew closer, the source of the light came into view. A small campsite. A single tent, a fire pit with glowing embers, and a camping chair. But no people. I called out, my voice hoarse from hours of silence. No response. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of the campers. The fire was recent, the embers still hot, but the tent was zipped shut and silent. I didn't have time to dwell on the oddness of the situation. I was cold, hungry, and desperate for rest. I decided to wait there, hoping the campers would return soon. They never did. By morning, I was still alone. The campsite felt eerie in the daylight, its emptiness almost unnatural. I left a note scrawled on a scrap of paper, explaining who I was and what had happened, and started walking again. Eventually, I found the main trail. The sight of the well-worn path was a relief unlike anything I'd ever felt. Hours later, I stumbled back to the trailhead, battered, dehydrated, but alive. To this day, I don't know who left that campsite or why they abandoned it. But I'll never forget the feeling of standing there in the firelight, knowing that someone or something had been there not long before me. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the solitude of the trails, the fresh air, and the sense of accomplishment that comes with reaching the end of a tough trek. Growing up in Vermont, I spent most weekends exploring the woods near my house. So even as an adult living in Switzerland, I made time to find new trails and push myself further. This story, though, is about the time I learned how dangerous that love of hiking could be. It was a lesson I won't ever forget, one that comes back to me every time I lace up my boots or check the weather before heading out. It started as an idea for a weekend adventure. I'd been reading about a lesser-known trail in the Swiss Alps, a long, challenging route that wound through valleys, climbed steep ridges, and offered panoramic views at its peak. The reviews warned of unpredictable weather and rough terrain, but they also raved about the trail's beauty. I was sold. I planned to hike alone as I usually did. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, but hiking solo gave me the freedom to move at my own pace and take in the scenery without distractions. I packed meticulously. A sturdy pair of boots, layers of clothing for changing temperatures, high-energy snacks, a headlamp, a first aid kit, and plenty of water. I also packed my GPS device and a map of the area. I double-checked everything before leaving the house. The morning of the hike was perfect. The sky was a soft, cloudless blue, and the air carried that crisp mountain scent. I parked my car at the trailhead and checked my map one last time. The trail stretched for about 20 kilometers with a steep ascent toward the middle. It would take me most of the day to complete, but I felt confident. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was well marked, winding through dense pine forests and opening occasionally to reveal sweeping views of the valleys below. I stopped now and then to take pictures, but I kept a steady pace, knowing the climb ahead would be tough. By midday, I'd reached the base of the steep ascent. The trail grew rockier, and the trees thinned out, giving way to exposed ridges. Clouds had started to gather, but they didn't look threatening yet, so I pressed on. Halfway up the ridge, I noticed the wind picking up. It was colder now, and the clouds overhead were darker than before. I paused to pull on a jacket and check my GPS. The summit wasn't far, maybe another hour of climbing. I decided to push on, thinking I could handle a bit of bad weather if it came. The climb was grueling. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and the incline forced me to stop frequently to catch my breath. By the time I reached the summit, the wind was howling, and the clouds had thickened into a solid gray mass. The views I'd hoped for were obscured by mist, but I didn't let that dampen my spirits. I felt a surge of pride standing there, knowing I'd made it to the top. I didn't stay long. The weather was turning quickly, and I knew the descent would be treacherous if the rocks got wet. As I started down the other side of the ridge, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it was pouring. The trail turned slick, and the wind made it hard to keep my balance. I moved carefully, planting each step firmly before shifting my weight. Despite my caution, I slipped several times, scraping my hands and knees on the sharp rocks. My jacket kept me dry at first, but the relentless rain soon soaked through, chilling me to the bone. The worst moment came when I realized I'd lost the trail. The rain had washed away the markers painted on the rocks, and the fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. I stopped and tried to orient myself using my map and GPS, but the signal was spotty in the storm. I felt a knot of panic tighten in my chest. I forced myself to stay calm. I knew the general direction I needed to go, and I figured I could find my way back to the trail if I moved slowly and kept an eye out for landmarks. But every step I took seemed to lead me further into the wilderness. The rain continued to hammer down, and the light was fading fast. As night fell, I realized I wouldn't make it back to the trailhead that day. I needed to find shelter and wait out the storm. The thought of spending a night alone in the mountains was terrifying, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I searched for a safe spot to hunker down, eventually finding a small overhang in the rocks. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the wind and rain. I used my pack as a cushion and wrapped myself in the emergency blanket from my first aid kit. The hours passed slowly. The cold seeped into my bones, and the howling wind made it impossible to sleep. I kept my headlamp on, the beam cutting through the darkness, as I scanned the area for any signs of wildlife. I was alone, utterly alone, and every sound seemed amplified by the silence of the mountains. By dawn, the storm had passed. The rain had stopped, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. I felt a wave of relief as the first rays of sunlight warmed my face. I ate a quick breakfast of energy bars and set out to find the trail. The descent was slow and painful. My legs ached, and my scraped hands stung every time I touched the rough rocks. But I was determined to make it back. I used the sun to guide me, keeping it to my left as I worked my way down the mountain. Hours later, I finally spotted a familiar marker. The sight filled me with renewed energy, and I quickened my pace, despite the exhaustion weighing me down. The trailhead came into view in the late afternoon, and I nearly cried with relief when I saw my car parked where I'd left it. As I sat in the driver's seat, blasting the heater and sipping from a thermos of lukewarm coffee, I thought about the experience. I'd made mistakes, underestimating the weather, losing the trail, but I'd also learned a lot. I'd stayed calm under pressure and relied on my skills to get through a dangerous situation. That hike changed the way I approached the outdoors. Now, I'm more cautious, more respectful of the mountains and their unpredictable nature. I still hike solo, but I plan more carefully and always let someone know where I'm going. Looking back, I'm grateful for that experience. It taught me not just about survival, but also about the strength we all have when we're pushed to our limits. Hiking will always be a part of my life, but I'll never forget the lesson the mountains taught me that day. I've always loved hiking, There's something about the rhythm of walking through the woods that makes me feel connected to the world. It's peaceful, and it gives me time to clear my head. This story, though, isn't about peace or clarity. It's about a hike I'll never forget, and not for any good reason. It happened last summer. I had just moved to Switzerland and was eager to explore the trails. The Alps were practically in my backyard, and I couldn't wait to tackle some of the famous routes I'd read about. I planned a solo hike to a remote area where the views were said to be breathtaking. The trail I chose was called the Kaltenhorn Loop, known for its rugged beauty and steep climbs. It was challenging but not beyond my skill level. I packed carefully, enough water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and my GPS device. I double-checked everything before setting out early in the morning. The forecast promised clear skies, and I was excited to spend the whole day out there. The first few hours were incredible. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The trail climbed steadily, and every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of the valley below. It was everything I'd hoped for. About halfway through the loop, the terrain started to change. The trees thinned out, and the trail became rockier. It was harder to follow, with faint markers and loose stones making every step uncertain. I was high enough now that the air was cooler, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. I reached a plateau and decided it was a good place to rest. The view was stunning, mountains stretching as far as I could see, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. I ate a quick snack and checked the GPS. Everything seemed fine. I was on track, and I figured I'd finish the loop by late afternoon. But as I started to descend the other side of the plateau, things took a turn. The trail, already faint, began to disappear entirely in places. I had to rely more and more on my GPS, and even then, it wasn't always clear. The rocks looked the same in every direction, and the markers, if there were any, were hidden or faded. I should have turned back. That thought haunts me now, but I was stubborn. I told myself I'd find the trail again soon, that it couldn't have vanished entirely. The descent became steeper, and the loose rocks made every step treacherous. At one point, I slipped and fell hard, scraping my knee and tearing a hole in my pants. It wasn't serious, but it rattled me. I realized how alone I was out here. No one knew exactly where I was, and there was no cell signal this deep in the mountains. I kept going, determined to get back on track. The GPS showed I was close to the trail, but every time I thought I'd found it, it would fade away again. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows that made the terrain even harder to read. By the time I admitted I was lost, it was late afternoon. The panic came slowly, creeping in as I realized how far I was from help. I forced myself to stay calm. I still had supplies, and I could spend the night out here if I had to. I found a relatively flat spot to sit and reassess. The GPS wasn't much help anymore. The signal was spotty, and the map was hard to interpret. I decided to backtrack, hoping I could find the trail where I'd lost it. As I climbed back up, the light faded quickly. The forest around me seemed to close in, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I knew it was just animals, probably small ones, but in the growing darkness, every sound felt threatening. Night fell before I found the trail. I had no choice but to stop. I used my headlamp to set up a makeshift camp, just a space to sit and rest with my backpack as a pillow. I didn't have a tent, but I did have a thermal blanket to keep warm. I barely slept. The cold seeped into my bones, and the sounds of the forest were constant. Branches creaked in the wind, and occasionally, I'd hear something larger moving in the distance. It was likely deer or maybe a fox, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The worst part was the darkness. It was absolute, swallowing everything beyond the narrow beam of my headlamp. I kept it on for as long as the battery would last, but eventually I had to conserve power. When dawn finally came, I felt a rush of relief. The forest didn't seem as threatening in the light, and I was eager to get moving. I decided to keep heading back the way I'd come, hoping to find a familiar landmark or a better signal for the GPS. The second day was a blur of exhaustion and frustration. I was dehydrated, having rationed my water overnight, and every step felt heavier than the last. I slipped again, this time twisting my ankle. The pain wasn't unbearable, but it slowed me down even more. By mid-afternoon, I was desperate. I hadn't seen any sign of the trail, and the mountains seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I started to doubt my decision to backtrack. Maybe I'd gone too far in the wrong direction. Then I heard it, the faint sound of running water. It was distant, but it gave me hope. If I could find a stream, I'd at least have water, and maybe it would lead me to a larger body of water or even a trail. I followed the sound, stumbling over rocks and through dense undergrowth. When I finally found the stream, I practically collapsed beside it. The water was icy and clear, and I drank as much as I could. It was a small victory, but it gave me the strength to keep going. I decided to follow the stream downstream, reasoning that it would lead me to a valley or a larger trail. The going was slow, with thick vegetation and slippery rocks making every step a challenge. Hours passed, and the stream widened slightly, giving me more space to walk. I began to notice signs of human activity: an old fire pit, a piece of discarded rope tangled in the bushes. It wasn't much, but it told me I wasn't as far from civilization as I'd feared. Finally, just as the sun was setting on my second day, I spotted a cabin in the distance. It was small and weathered, but it was a sign of hope. I limped toward it, my ankle throbbing with every step. When I reached the cabin, I found it empty. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was shelter, and it had a wood stove and a stack of dry firewood. I started a fire and warmed myself for the first time in 2 days. That night, I slept deeply, exhaustion overpowering my fear. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices. A group of hikers had found the cabin, drawn by the smoke from my fire. They were as surprised to see me as I was to see them. They helped me back to their camp, where they had a satellite phone to call for help. By the end of the day, I was safe, though bruised and battered. I've thought about that hike a lot since then. It taught me the importance of preparation and humility. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also unforgiving. I still hike, but I'm more cautious now, and I never go into the wilderness without letting someone know exactly where I'll be. That experience changed me. It reminded me that nature doesn't care about your plans or your confidence. It's up to you to respect it and to be ready for whatever it throws your way.